Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking time to join us here at MEF18. It's great to see everybody, and as Nan said, I'd just like to thank everybody for their continued enthusiasm for what we try to accomplish at MEF each day, and for all the energy that hundreds and hundreds of people put in and have put into making these things successful. A year ago, I stood up and I talked about what we at Comcast Business have termed a generational moment. And to me, that video is sort of the summation of that generational moment. It's this notion that we're at a very special time in our industry, and that special time is brought to us by the interlocking of two forces. And those two forces, in our mind, are software-defined networking and the emergence of gigabit broadband in the last mile. What we see happening with these two things coming together is software-defined networking is fundamentally changing and is going to fundamentally change pretty much how the industry functions. I often joke that our industry has long been characterized by what I call the tyranny of the boxes. That if you go into the back office of any one of our customers, what you'll see is a stack of boxes, and the boxes are expensive, and the boxes all require care and feeding, and the boxes all need security patches done, and the boxes all have a million cables hanging out of them, and the boxes depreciate over a long time, and the boxes are essentially in charge. And that has been how our industry has functioned for a long, long time. But with computing coming as far as it has, and our ability to now do those functions in software, you see a revolutionary impact on the industry in terms of the innovation velocity, the innovation quality, how competition functions, and how fast our customers are going to be able to innovate in how they run their own networks. Obviously, that leads us directly into SD-WAN, which we see as really the key to unlocking what broadband networks and high-capacity networks bring to the table at this point. MPLS is a wonderful technology, but we're starting to see another alternative out there in the market. And the ability to do all this on a consistent, simple piece of CPE obviously has wonderful effects for scale economies and for quality. Anytime you can do something in a consistent fashion, you really wind up just doing a better job of keeping everything reliable. On the other side of the equation, we really see the emergence of gigabit broadband as transformational. This is something, obviously, this is what we do every day. This is our bread and butter, is what goes on in the last mile of telecommunications networks here in the United States. And the fact that we've now hit a point in time where you can put a gigabit of bandwidth into virtually any business. You can put it into homes. I have a gigabit of bandwidth to my home that has been delivered not just through the network upgrades, but through a very simple piece of CPE into my house. And the fact that with that CPE deployed, a customer who maybe has 300 megabits when they start can literally call us and say, I'd rather have a gigabit, and we can provision that very, very quickly just by changing the boot file. That is a transformational moment in our industry. No one has ever had access to capacity like this. For a long time, you could get gigabit services to tall, shiny buildings. They were expensive, but you could get them. And then as Ethernet pushed further out and fiber pushed out a bit more, you could get into short, shiny buildings, but now you can get them to the dentist. You can get gigabit networks to the doctor. You can get gigabit networks to the accountant. And that is a fundamental moment in our industry. When you put these two things together, what we see coming forth is really the elimination of bandwidth barriers. A gigabit is a lot of bandwidth, it turns out. You see radical simplification in how everything functions, and you see and are seeing radical price compression. It's a transformational moment in the industry, and I think it's one to really seize and grab hold of. I want to talk a little bit about that last mile. So if I rewind the tape and I go back to 2006, which is when we started Comcast Business, we used to say that a T1 in the United States here cost about $600 a month. Obviously, T1 pricing is very variable. You find them less than that, you find them more than that, but we used to say $600 was probably a fair reference point. Well, T1 does 1.5 meg, so that meant a mega bandwidth was about $400, and that was the gold standard back then. If you look at gigabit broadband, out there for about $500 now, you're talking about going from a meg for $400 to a gig for $500 over the course of 12 years or so. That's Moore's Law class price compression on those capabilities, right? So, in 2006, that T1 was $400 a meg. We stepped in with a 4 meg product that brought a 90% price compression. You can kind of see the the evolution of those price per megabit per second there, but you talk about getting down to that gig, you're sub $1, well sub $1 obviously, in terms of price per megabit. It's really revolutionary. And if you look at Comcast now, 96% of our footprint is now deployed with gigabit product, and that means over 4 million businesses can get a gigabit of bandwidth to their location on a pretty transactional basis. So I'm proud that Comcast now operates the largest gigabit network in the industry. But I think you see this as more of an industry phenomenon than a Comcast phenomenon. Certainly all the other cable operators here and abroad are going to be leveraging these same technologies and I think finishing this industry transformation. On the other side, you have what's going on with ActiveCore, which is our software-defined networking platform. And I think it's important as folks understand us and think about the industry to keep a wedge between what is a platform and what is a product. And indeed, I think sometimes customers conflate the two. And so we'd be very clear that how we think about the world is make sure you have a great SDN platform. And that's our ActiveCore platform. And it was built on 4 key pillars. The first was that it was fully hosted. We think this is a time when things should be virtualized. Customers shouldn't have to put lots and lots of stuff in their data center. We can do that on a carrier-grade basis in our network. Certainly, it's how lots of companies are operating now. We think it had to be multi-VNF from the ground up. You didn't want a one-trick pony. It does this thing very well in software, but not much else because the world's changing so fast. We think it had to be gigabit ready. If you believe what I just said on the first page, on the other page, then what you should realize is that things like bandwidth on demand and a lot of the things that we used to have to solve in a world where 10 megs was hard to get and 20 was even harder, kind of go away. Because now you can just do it, put a gigabit in and sort of stop worrying about it. So we wanted every service out there to be gigabit ready. And then finally, we think there's a wonderful moment going on with the groundbreaking digital experience, that there's such an opportunity to simplify how telecommunications work. You know, time and again, we see that the #1 barrier customers face, and indeed a lot of us face in the room, is talent. Can we find the people who are really good at running this stuff? And I think if we bring digital experiences to the forefront, if we invest in ways to simplify, we can allow our customers and their employees to focus on higher value business problems and make their networks much easier to run. You know, in the video, you may have noticed in the backdrop some of the consumer style digital experiences, very colorful, map driven, easy to see. But you also may have noticed the gentleman in the car say, ActiveCore, how's my network doing? That's actually real. We've plugged ActiveCore into Alexa at this point, and that use case is a use case that one of our customers told us about, that using Alexa, he would find out about how his network's performing from the car on his way to work. That's a transformational thing. It's not a toy, it's a tool. And I think we see our customers really resonating with digital experiences and simplification. On the other side, when you think about SD-WAN, we thought there's a couple important pillars as we step into SD-WAN. The first was, again, with this gigabit last mile in mind, to emphasize over-the-top services. When you have a gigabit of capacity and you can do queue management at layer 3, it's not obvious that you need to do quite so much at layer 2. And we think ubiquity and reach trumps maybe complexity there. And so we think over-the-top is super important as you think about SD-WAN. The second is keep it simple. Keep it simple, keep it simple. For us, keep it simple manifested as making sure the router and firewall are included, and it was just simple for the customer to engage with and purchase. But I think included router and firewall is really code for keep it simple. Simplified policy management. We have to find a way to make these networks easier to work with. We have to find a way to make them more reliable. And so this is really the cousin of the digital experience. How can I bring software technology and software experiences to make the network easier to run for our customers? Obviously, as we go to multiple VNFs, this is always going to be the tension in the system. When you're dealing with service orchestration, we're dealing with service chaining, when you're dealing with things like security, where you just see this rapid revolution in the threats and the proliferation of attack vectors causing this rapid revolution in the number of tools to respond to it. Finding that balance between keep it simple versus have the full functionality needed, I think, is going to be the tension in the system for many, many years. But done properly, software-defined networking is an opportunity to bring simplicity to the problem. And finally, design for hybrid WAN. You know, the world is got a lot of legacy technologies out there. They're not going to go away overnight. And so these things need to coexist, but bring that software-defined networking platform into an environment that can work on existing WAN technology, new WAN technology. We're only going to see a proliferation of those things. So we think these are the right foundational elements to go into an SDN implementation, and particularly an SDN implementation that sits on top of a gigabit view of the world. I think if you don't have a gigabit view of the world, then you maybe make other choices in how you invest and design your software-defined networking and your SD-WAN capabilities. But if you have that gigabit view, we think these are in fact the right pillars. And we've been out talking to lots and lots of customers, lots and lots of folks in the industry, and I'm pleased to say customers are telling us this is actually a very good strategy and a very good story, and we're also seeing industry recognition for it. And I think it's wonderful to see the products recognized, and I'm very appreciative of all the folks and all the hard work that has been done by the Comcast folks and all of our vendor partners to bring these things to life. But I don't sort of think of these as a recognition of the products themselves. I think of them as a recognition of the strategy, that as we get out there and we talk to folks about this generational moment, people say that makes a ton of sense, and it's causing people to think differently. We had our analyst conference recently. We had wonderful interactions with the analysts, and I think folks really do resonate with this overall approach and strategy. So, we'll be back here in a year and a year and a year, and we'll talk about how's this generational moment playing out. But I have to say right now, I think it is sort of coming into focus as the way it's going to work. I would share some key learnings we've had over the last year or so. It's not, this is a very young set of technologies. Anybody who thinks they have a hammerlock on how all this stuff's going to work and how customers are going to use it and how fast it's going to deploy and evolve is probably kidding themselves. So we certainly learn every single day at Comcast Business from talking to our customers, and I just thought I'd share some of what we're seeing. The first is that over-the-top makes a lot of sense. Actually, there's almost a built-in assumption from a lot of customers that a carrier would be more, I want you on my network, I need to lock you into my network. And once they understand over-the-top and they think about the bandwidth, we get very, very good feedback on that. So I think that's bearing fruit as an important thing. We'll see how that plays out as implementations go and customers get more comfortable with the real queuing technology and prioritization and things, but I think it's been well received, and I think it's the right path. The flip side of that is 1 gig is a non sequitur in this industry for most people who are designing networks. Our colleagues at all these companies have made their living for 25 years doing incredible things to torture capacity out of bandwidth-constrained networks to make applications work. It's fun to talk with them. They are proud of what they've managed to do with last-mile technologies that weren't actually giving them the bandwidth they really needed to power digital transformation and customer experiences. Rightly proud. It's a lot of hard work. But sometimes you say to them, what would you do with a gig? And they've never even thought about that. And so it's fun to actually talk to customers about it, but it is a bit of a non sequitur, so I don't know that you're going to see everybody in the world flip to a gigabit overnight, but they're starting to think about what to do with it. The third one, and I think this is actually one of the hardest problems our industry is going to have to solve, is what I call digital desert sites. It's basic networking economics that where you have density, it's easier to get the networks out there, get returns on them, make it a good financial investment for a company. There are lots of places in our country that simply don't have that density, and so it's really difficult to get the network out there. When you talk to large customers and you talk to them about deploying some of these SD-WAN technologies and taking advantage of the gigabit world, they're all in on it, but they immediately get to, but what do I do about the sites that are in the digital desert? And I think that is going to be one of the challenges for industry, because if we want this whole virtualization to happen, if we want the digital experience to happen, then we're going to need to help figure out how to do digital desert sites. And that might be transport technology, that might be application architecture so that the applications can live gracefully in a constrained bandwidth world. But that is something that we see time and again from customers that needs to be sorted out. Another thing we see is that folks are eager to get rid of MPLS, maybe a bit more than I expected. I'm not standing here and saying the demise of MPLS is nigh. And last year I mentioned I think it's going to take a long time for MPLS to ramp down. You just don't ever see a networking technology that has had the success and reach of MPLS go away overnight. But I am interested how much customers are telling us, I really would just like to get to a dual broadband world or a broadband plus wireless backup world. and dispense with MPLS. So it'll be interesting to see how fast this migration takes place, but it's maybe a bit more poignant than we might have expected. And then finally, customers are now very, very aware of the vendor lock issue, particularly in the face of security problems. We see these security threats proliferate, and if you're in a vendor lock situation, it's hard to respond to those threats quickly because you're back to the tyranny of the boxes. But if you're in a software world where maybe you can bring new technology on faster, customers really recognize that as an emerging benefit. It's more the promise of where this thing is going than the reality of where it is today. But when you talk to folks about it, it really makes a lot of sense to them. So these are things we've learned over the last year or so. We continue to learn every day. I'm sure a year from now we'll be sharing additional things we've learned. But overall, we're very encouraged by the promise of this generational moment and what it means for our customers. I'd like to wrap up here by really talking about what the MEF is doing and why it's important. I've been around the MEF for, I guess, closing in on a decade now in various shapes and a couple stints on the board. And the role of standards is so unappreciated or underappreciated sometimes in our world. Standards are what allow us to scale these businesses effectively, right? Because they allow us to go after a couple of really key issues. First is interoperability, right? That customers want their networks to talk to each other. We live in a wonderfully competitive multi-network environment, and not trapping those customers into things that don't talk to each other. The second is quality. The more you can do things the same way, the more you can have vendors and our suppliers investing in common frameworks, the higher quality can go because you're dealing with fewer vagaries and difficult interactions between non-standardized things. Scale. It allows us to focus on scaling these things, whether it's equipment or software, network management solutions. Scale is everybody's best friend because it takes so much cost out of the business. And then finally, value-based competition. I don't ever want to be in my own vendor lock situation. I want suppliers to come to me and compete on the basis of the value they bring me, not some proprietary solution that I got locked into and can't get out of. And I assure you, my customers also want to see Comcast compete on the basis of adding value and not on the basis of some type of proprietary thing that they can't get out of. These 5 things done well are the outgrowth of standards, and they're the outgrowth of the work that the MEF does. And I think if you look at the global success of Carrier Ethernet, it was that you could hang so many of what we did with Carrier Ethernet on the back of these 5 things. So as we think about an SDN world, I think it's really important to think about MEF 3.0 as a really critical industry contribution. And so I'd like to thank everyone who's been involved in bringing that to life over the last couple of years. I think they've made tremendous progress, and we're starting to see the fruits of that labor. And I encourage everybody to continue to participate and continue to help invest in MEF 3.0. These specs, I think, can do a lot of great things for our industry and for our customers. So it's important to driving what we see as part of this generational moment. So with that, I'd like to thank you. I hope you have a great day. Enjoy the conference, and I hope it was good use of your time. Take care. Thanks.